The man I put in handcuffs on the night of September 4th, 1969, did not belong to any category I had ever been trained to process. The categories I had been trained to work with in 22 months of service did not apply to him, not legally, not medically, and not in any operational framework I possessed. He was approximately 7 feet tall, weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and when I reached for his wrist to complete the arrest, his hand closed gently around my forearm instead, not to resist, not to threaten, but in a gesture so measured and so calm that I stopped moving entirely. He looked at me with eyes that were dark brown and set deep under a brow that jutted further than any human forehead I had seen, and he said in English, that was slow and slightly off in its rhythms, but perfectly intelligible, that he had not done anything wrong and that he was sorry about the fence. The fence he was referring to belonged to Orville Dupuis, a raspberry farmer on the Lockheed Highway east of Agassiz, British Columbia. The fence was not the problem. The man standing on the wrong side of it was. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Gordon Hesketh. I am 79 years old. I retired from the RCMP in 1993 after 26 years of service, the last 12 of them as a staff sergeant at the Chilliwack Detachment. I have spent the better part of a decade deciding whether to speak about what happened that September, and I have decided to do it now because the man from the Dupuis farm has been on my mind more consistently in the last few years than at any other point in my life, and I believe the reason for that is simple. I am running out of time to tell it. My doctor, a careful woman named Dr. Priya Nair at Chilliwack General, told me in May that my heart is doing what old hearts do, and that I should not be surprised if the next 5 years are my last comfortable ones. I'm not frightened by this. I am 80 years old in January. I have had a good life and a full one. But I will not go to my grave having kept this to myself, because what I saw in that detachment holding room in the fall of 1969 was real, and it mattered, and somebody needs to say so. I will tell you everything I remember. There is a great deal of it, and I will tell it in the order it happened because the sequence matters. The sequence is what explains how a 24-year-old constable with 22 months on the job ended up sitting across the table from the most significant individual I have ever encountered, and why, by 10 o'clock the following morning, the file recording that encounter had been closed, initialed, and stamped with a classification that I did not have the clearance to read. I was posted to the Agassiz Detachment in January of 1968, fresh out of the RCMP Training Academy at Depot Division in Regina. Agassiz was not a posting that the more ambitious recruits were competing for. It was a small town of perhaps 3,000 people in the eastern Fraser Valley, pinched between the Fraser River to the south and the mountains of the Coast Range to the north, the kind of place where the main employers were the federal penitentiary, the experimental farm, and the raspberry and blueberry operations that spread across the flat valley bottom in every direction. The winters were wet and gray in the particular way that coastal British Columbia winters are wet and gray, which is to say the sky sits on the mountains for weeks at a time, and everything smells of mud and wood smoke, and the summers were genuinely beautiful, warm and green, with the snow on the peaks finally visible above the clouds. I had grown up in Lethbridge, Alberta, and the Coast Range was unlike anything in my experience. The scale of it, the density of the timber, the way the mountains rose straight from the valley floor without foothills, a wall of rock and forest that made you feel on certain days as if the world had simply run out of room. There were 2 of us at the Agassiz Detachment, plus our corporal. The corporal was a man named Bud Keswick, 43 years old, a 17-year veteran who had come to Agassiz from a posting in the Yukon and treated the Fraser Valley with the tolerant boredom of a man who had already seen the worst and most remote that Canada had to offer. Bud was not unfriendly, he was just economical with his engagement. He told me on my first day that Agassiz was quiet, that the penitentiary was the biggest source of paperwork, that the Fraser Valley Indian Band would call us occasionally for situations that were better handled internally, but for which they needed the appearance of outside involvement, and that whatever I had been trained to expect in the way of serious crime, I should revise those expectations downward significantly. The other constable was a man named Wayne Tremblay, 26 years old, from Moncton originally, who had been at the detachment for a year before I arrived, and who seemed to have made his peace with the posting, by developing an encyclopedic knowledge of every fishing hole within 50 miles. Wayne was the sort of person who occupied whatever space he was in without friction, easy to talk to, untroubled by long silences, reliable in a way that had nothing to do with enthusiasm. My first year was exactly as Bud had described. Traffic stops on the Lougheed Highway, a break-in at the feed store in town, a drowning near the mouth of the Harrison River, which was one of the harder things I had dealt with to that point in my life, pulling a man out of the water who had been there for 2 days and filling out the paperwork for his family later that afternoon. Domestic situations in the valley that required showing up and standing in someone's kitchen until everyone's temperature came down. Occasional calls from the experimental farm about trespassers, though the trespassers were usually teenagers interested in the test plots for reasons that had nothing to do with agriculture. It was not dull work exactly. It was the work of keeping a small community from unraveling at the edges, which is its own kind of demanding. By September of 1969, I had been at the detachment for 20 months. I knew the valley well enough to drive the back roads at night without consulting a map. I knew which farms were run by people who would call us for anything and which were run by people who would handle things themselves and only call us once the situation had already resolved, which meant showing up to document an outcome rather than prevent one. Orville Dupuis was in the second category. He was 61 years old, had been running raspberry fields along a 2-mile stretch of the Lougheed east of town since his father had planted the first canes in 1938, and his general position on law enforcement was that the RCMP was an institution best engaged with, rarely and briefly. So when his truck came pulling into the detachment yard at 8:30 on a Thursday evening, I noticed it immediately. I was at my desk finishing an incident report when Bud came to the doorway and told me Orville Dupuis was outside. He was not sure what kind of call, but Orville had the look on his face that men get when they have seen something they cannot explain and are trying to decide whether explaining it is worth the embarrassment. I had not seen that particular look before. I would spend the rest of the night looking at different versions of it. I went outside. Orville was standing by his truck, a 63 Ford half-ton with a cracked taillight and a front bumper that had been straightened at least twice. He was a stocky man with a white mustache and hands that were permanently stained with the red of raspberry juice, the particular staining that comes when you work the same crop for 30 years. He looked at me, and I could see that Bud had been right about the expression. It was a look that said the man wanted to report something, but was also hoping I would find a reason not to take him seriously, because being taken seriously meant committing to the version of events he had witnessed. He told me, speaking slowly and without preamble, that there was a man in his raspberry field who was too big to be a man. He said he had gone out at dusk to check the irrigation lines on the northeast section, the one that butted up against the edge of the timber that rose from the valley floor toward the base of Mount Cheam, and he had found a section of fence knocked down, 2 cedar posts snapped off at the ground, and a figure standing at the far end of the row eating raspberries directly off the canes. He said he had called out, that the figure had turned and looked at him, and that he had then walked back to his truck and driven to town. He did not run. He made that clear to me. He walked. There is a difference, and the distinction mattered to him. I asked Orville to describe the figure. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand and looked at the gravel of the parking area for a moment. Then he said it was tall, very tall, maybe 1.5 feet above his own height, which put it around 7 feet based on Orville's own 5'10". He said it was broad through the chest and shoulders. He said it was covered in hair, but he also mentioned that it was wearing a garment around its waist, a garment of some kind, old cloth. From what he could see at that distance in the fading light, he said this was part of what unsettled him. A wild animal does not wear clothing. A person does not eat raspberries directly off the cane in someone's field at dusk without explanation. He did not know what category the thing in his field belonged to, and that uncertainty was what had driven him to town. I told Orville I would go out and take a look. He asked if I wanted him to come with me. I told him no, and that I would call him in the morning. He seemed relieved by this. He nodded, got back in his Ford, and backed out of the lot without another word. I debated calling Wayne for backup. I decided against it. I did not yet have a clear picture of what I was going to find, and waking Wayne for what might turn out to be a large man having a private picnic seemed premature. I took my service belt, my flashlight, and my ticket book out of habit, and I drove east on the Lockheed in the gray September dusk. The Dupuy farm ran along the south side of the highway for perhaps 2 miles before the property boundary met the edge of the timber. The road into the northeast field was a gravel track between two rows of mature canes, the plants about chest high on me, laden with the last raspberries of the season that had not been picked yet. The headlights of my cruiser cut through the dusk and caught the shine of the galvanized irrigation pipe, and I drove slowly, watching the edge of the field where it met the tree line. The trees there were big Douglas fir, not old growth, but close to it, 60 or 70 years in age, the trunks dark in the failing light and the understory beneath them black. Where the trees began, the farm ended, and the slope went up steeply toward the rock and ice of the mountains beyond. I saw him before he saw me, or at least before he acknowledged that he saw me. He was standing at the far end of the field, maybe 150 yards from where I had stopped the cruiser. He was facing the tree line with his back mostly toward me, and the size of him was the first thing that registered, even at that distance. The raspberry canes came to my chest. They came to his hips. He was leaning forward slightly, his right hand extended into the canes, moving with the focused attention of a man doing a job he knew well. Picking. He was picking raspberries in Orville Dupuy's field at 8:40 in the evening, and the scale of him relative to the plants made the scene impossible to process through any ordinary lens. I sat in the cruiser with my hand on the door handle, and I did not get out for a moment. I want to be honest about that. I sat there with the headlights cutting across the field and the figure at the far end of it, and I ran through every rational framework I had access to and discarded them one by one. A man in a costume. A man with a physical condition that produced unusual size and body hair. A trick of the dusk light and my own expectation, because stories about this country were not unknown to me. I had heard the kind of thing that gets said in valley communities when the timber is close and the dark comes early, the half-serious references to what lives in the mountains, the jokes at the bar in Harrison Hot Springs that stopped being jokes the moment anyone looked too closely at them. I had filed those stories where you file stories you cannot verify, which is in the back of the drawer where they do not interfere with daily function. The thing standing at the far end of the Dupuy field did not fit in any drawer I got out. I left the headlights on because I needed to see, and because some part of me wanted it illuminated, wanted the ordinary yellow wash of a cruiser's headlights to make it ordinary. The gravel track between the cane rows was uneven, and I kept my flashlight on the ground in front of me. The evening air smelled of ripe berries and damp soil, and a scent that was not either of those things, animal and warm and present, the way the smell of a large dog is present when you enter a house, a living heat that had settled into the air of the field and was not moving. It grew stronger as I walked. By 30 yards from the cruiser, I was breathing it, and my body was doing things that the RCMP Academy had trained me to suppress. The pulse in my temples, the narrowing of my vision, the ancient signal that the hindbrain sends when it has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion that the rest of the mind is not yet ready to receive. I kept walking. I was 24 years old. I had a service revolver and a flashlight and the professional authority of the Crown, and I was walking toward a thing that the Crown had no protocol for. At about 50 yards, he turned around. Not quickly, not with alarm. He turned as someone turns when they have heard an approaching sound and have taken a moment to assess it before responding. He straightened to his full height, and I stopped walking.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
I got out of the cruiser. I left the headlights on. I walked toward him slowly, my hand near my service revolver, not because I had decided I needed it, but because my training had taught my hand where to go in uncertain situations. The gravel track between the cane rows was uneven, and I kept my flashlight on the ground in front of me. The evening air smelled of ripe berries and damp soil, and a scent that was not either of those things, animal and warm and present, the way the smell of a large dog is present when you enter a house, a living heat that had settled into the air of the field and was not moving. At about 50 yards, he turned around. Not quickly, not with alarm. He turned as someone turns when they have heard an approaching sound and have taken a moment to assess it before responding. He straightened to his full height, and I stopped walking. He was between 7 feet and 7 feet 3, I estimated later. He was wearing, as Orville had noted, a garment around his lower half, a piece of rough canvas or heavy cloth, faded to no particular color, wrapped and tied at his waist, which suggested he had made it himself or had it made for him. Above the waist he was bare, and his chest and arms and shoulders were covered in dense, dark brown hair, not the scattered body hair of a large man, but a full covering, consistent across his torso and arms, darker on his chest and lighter on his forearms, where it thinned toward the heavier forearm hair of a man with Northern European ancestry. His face was the face that I have spent 55 years trying to describe accurately to myself. It was not the face of anything in any field guide or natural history text I had read. The nose was broad and the jaw was wider and heavier than any human jaw, and the brow ridge over his eyes was pronounced enough to cast his eyes in slight shadow, even with my flashlight playing across his features. But the eyes themselves were human in their expressiveness, not animal. There was weight behind them. There was thought. He looked at me. I looked at him. For perhaps 10 seconds neither of us moved. Then he said in a voice that was low and that vibrated in my chest at a register below, where I was accustomed to feeling conversation, "I did not mean to break the fence." I have replayed that sentence in my mind more times than I could count. The cadence was off, slightly formal, the way someone speaks when they have learned a language from a single source rather than from a community of speakers. The words were clear, the grammar was correct, and the content of the sentence was, of all things, an apology. He had broken the fence, he had not intended to, and he was telling me so. I said, "Can you step away from the canes, please?" He stepped away from the canes. He moved with a fluidity that his size should not have permitted, each step careful and quiet on the gravel, and he came to a stop about 20 feet from me and waited, which is exactly what a cooperative person does when law enforcement has asked them to move. My hand was still near my holster. I made a conscious effort to move it to my side. I said, "My name is Constable Hesketh. I'm with the RCMP. The owner of this property called us about a trespasser. Are you aware you're on private land?" He looked at me steadily. Then he said, "I know where I am. I have been coming here for a long time." I wrote everything down later that night in a personal notebook that I still have, and the sentence I wrote for that exchange is exactly those words. I have been coming here for a long time. Not I did not know it was private, not I am sorry, not any of the things a trespasser typically says. He said he had been coming to this specific field for a long time, with the matter-of-fact quality of a man stating a fact about the world that he expected to be accepted as a fact. I told him that the field was private property and that the owner did not want unauthorized persons on his land, and that he would need to come with me to the detachment. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked past me at the cruiser with its headlights on in the dusk, and then he looked back at me. He said, "I have not been to a detachment before," and I told him that was fine and that I just needed to ask him some questions. He nodded exactly as someone does when they understand what is being asked of them and are weighing their options. Then he said, "All right." I reached for his wrist to apply the handcuffs, and that was when he gently took hold of my forearm instead, which I have described already. His grip was not tight, it was not aggressive. It was the grip of someone who wanted me to stop for a moment before the situation moved to its next stage. I stopped. He said quietly, "Is that necessary?" It was not a challenge, it was a genuine question. I thought about it for a moment. I said, "If you come with me calmly, we can skip that part." He released my arm. He said, "I will come calmly." He fit in the back of the cruiser only because he angled himself sideways across the seat, his knees pressed against the security partition and his left shoulder against the door. He filled the rear compartment like cargo fitted into a space designed for something smaller. I could see him in the rearview mirror when the passing headlights of oncoming traffic lit the interior, sitting with his hands on his knees and watching the road through the windshield above my head. And his expression was one I recognized from people who have agreed to a course of action they are not sure about but have decided to see through. Cooperative resignation. He had come because he had chosen to come, and that distinction, I would understand later, was the most important fact of the evening. I radioed ahead to the detachment. I did not say what I was bringing in, I told Bud I had a trespasser and that I needed the back room for a bit. Fine, and he would put the coffee on. We pulled into the detachment yard at 9:47. I parked and came around to open the back door. The man unfolded himself from the rear seat with the careful attention of someone navigating a space that was not built for him, which it was not. When he stood on the gravel of the parking area fully upright, the overhead light of the lot caught him clearly for the first time, and I took a moment that I tried to make look like a professional assessment and used to simply look at him. His hair was dark brown with lighter streaks through it, as if he had spent considerable time outdoors. The garment around his waist was cotton. I could see now sections of what had been a heavy work shirt and possibly a pair of trousers stitched or tied together into a serviceable wrap. His feet were bare. The soles of his feet, visible as he shifted his weight on the gravel, were enormously thick, calloused to a degree that looked more like a hoof than a sole. I held the detachment door open. He ducked to clear the frame by a comfortable margin, which told me he had ducked through doorways before and knew exactly how much clearance he needed. He stepped into the front office and stood looking around the room with the same methodical attention he had given the cruiser in the parking area, taking in the radio equipment, the desk, the filing cabinets, the map of the Fraser Valley pinned to the wall, the mounted photograph of the Queen that had hung above the door since the detachment was built in 1951. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds without moving, just taking it in. I stood beside him and watched him do it. The radio was on low, the standard background murmur of dispatch traffic from elsewhere in the valley. The fluorescent light above the front desk was doing the faint buzzing that it had been doing for 3 months, and that I had been meaning to report. Outside on the Laheed, a logging truck went by and the windows shook slightly. None of this registered on his face. He was processing the room the way a person processes an environment they have been told about but never entered, comparing what they were shown in their mind against what they are seeing with their eyes. He stopped at the map, the Fraser Valley and district map pinned to the wall to the left of the door, the paper yellowed at the edges. He looked at it for a long moment without approaching it. Then he turned and looked at me with those dark, deep-set eyes, and he said, "I know where I am." He meant it geographically. He was not disoriented. He was not confused about his situation. He was standing in a room he had never entered, in a town he had apparently visited the edges of for decades, and he wanted me to know that the room did not change his understanding of where he stood in relation to the mountain and the forest and the rest of the landscape. That was the thing that hit me standing next to him in that small office. He was not afraid. He was not even particularly concerned. He was curious. He was taking in information. I realized somewhere in that 30 seconds that I was the one who was afraid. Not of him, or not exactly of him, of what his presence in that room meant, of the implications that were already beginning to accumulate, each one pressing against the next, a stack of facts that had no comfortable resting place. Bud Keswick came out of the back office, took one look, and stopped moving. His coffee mug was in his hand, and he stood absolutely still and looked at the man standing in the middle of his detachment office. And I watched Bud Keswick, 17-year RCMP veteran, conduct the fastest and most complete internal reassessment I have ever seen a human being perform. In about 3 seconds, he went from expecting a trespasser to understanding that whatever was standing in front of him was something outside any category he had encountered in 17 years of policing. His face went to a kind of professional blankness that is not the same as no expression. It is the expression of a man who is deferring all emotion until he has a moment to process privately. He said, "Evening." He said it as you say evening to someone at a garage sale when you're not sure if what they're selling is legal. The man said, "Nah, good evening." Bud looked at me. I nodded toward the back room. Bud nodded and went to get another chair. I brought the man to the back office, which served as our interview room, such as it was. It had a table, 3 chairs, a window that looked out on the parking area, and a map of Agassiz District. The chairs were standard office chairs. He looked at them with what I can only describe as mild skepticism, the expression of a man at a buffet who sees nothing he can eat. He selected the one that looked sturdiest and sat in it carefully. It held. The legs bowed outward slightly, but it held. I sat across from him with my notebook and asked him his name. He said, "Lorne." I wrote it down. I said, "Last name?" He looked at me for a moment. He said, "My mother's name was Kettner. I wrote Lorne Kettner." I asked him where he lived. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "On the mountain." I asked which mountain. "The one above the farm. Mount Cheam, which rises to around 2,100 meters above the Agassiz Valley floor." I asked him for an address. He looked at me steadily. "I do not have one." I asked his age. He said, 29. I noted this in my book. He was born in 1940 then. He looked older, though it was difficult to place precisely how much older, as a tree's age is difficult to read without cutting into it. The lines around his eyes were deep, and the skin beneath them was dark, but his movements lacked the caution of an older man. He moved like someone young with a physical confidence that did not need to announce itself. I asked him where he had grown up. He said, "Near here and on the mountain." I asked what he meant by near here. His mother had a house about 4 miles into the trees northeast of the Dupuis property. She had lived there from before he was born and had died when he was 17. He said this without any particular shift in tone, as someone states a fact about the world. I noted the year of her death, 1957. I asked him if he had any identification. He said he did not. I asked if he had ever had identification. No. I asked if he had been to school. His mother had taught him. I asked if he had a doctor. No. The questions I was asking were the questions I had been trained to ask, and they were all producing answers that were within the range of things a person could say, technically without it being illegal to say them. No fixed address, no identification, no institutional record. In rural British Columbia in 1969, there were people, particularly in the more remote parts of the province, who existed entirely outside the administrative systems that most Canadians took for granted. The province was full of homesteads and trappers' cabins and logging camps where men and women lived off the grid and off the record. On paper, Lorne Kettner was an unusual but not legally impossible person, the self-educated, unregistered son of a rural homesteader who had grown up in the bush and continued to live there after his mother's death. What was not within the range of things a person could be was everything that Bud and I could see when we looked at him. Bud had come in and was standing near the door with his coffee watching the interview. At one point he leaned over and said, quietly to me, his temperature. I looked at him. Bud nodded toward Lorne and said again quietly, "Feel the air around him, 3 feet. The air is different." I had noticed it before Bud said anything. The temperature in the back room had risen since Lorne sat down, not dramatically, but measurably. The room was running 3 or 4 degrees warmer than it had been when we walked in. It was a cool September evening, and we had not turned on any heat. The warmth was coming from him, radiating from his body as a wood stove that has been burning for hours radiates, a deep-seated, persistent heat that was not the surface warmth of a person running a fever. It was the warmth of a body running at a permanently elevated temperature, a thermostat set above the range that human physiology occupies. I asked Lorne to stand up. He stood. I asked if he would allow me to take his height. He said yes. I used the measuring tape I kept in my kit, 7 feet and 1 inch. I asked him to step on the scale we kept in the corner for impairment assessments. He stepped on it. The scale went to 350 pounds and pegged. I wrote down 350 plus and noted the scale limit. I asked him to place his right hand flat on the table. He did so. I placed my own hand beside it for comparison. My hand, which is not a small hand, is 8.5 inches from the base of my palm to the tip of my middle finger. His hand was 11.25 inches. His fingers were thick, not stubby, but thick as structural timbers relative to framing lumber. I asked him if I could take a photograph. He said he would prefer I did not. I asked why. He said because a photograph goes somewhere and I would not know where. This was, I want to be clear, a sophisticated and entirely rational response. He was not afraid of a camera in any superstitious sense. He was concerned about the distribution of his image to parties unknown. He understood that a photograph taken at a police detachment was evidence, that evidence entered systems, and that those systems were not ones he could monitor or influence. He was protecting himself with the same logic that a lawyer would use. Do not produce documentation that you cannot control. I did not take the photograph. I asked him about the fence. He described, without any apparent concern about self-incrimination, how he had come down from the mountain at dusk, as he had done many times over the years, to eat the raspberries in the field during harvest season. The fence had been repaired and extended since his last visit, he told me, and he had not realized the post was not secure until it gave way when he leaned against it. He had not intended to damage the farmer's property. He was willing to fix it if that would resolve the matter. I asked him how long he had been coming to the Dupuis field. He thought for a moment and said, "Since I was a child. My mother brought me first when I was small. The farmer then was different, older, the same family, but different." He was describing, I calculated, a period beginning in the mid-1940s. Orville's father had run the farm from before the war. Lorne had been walking down from the mountain to that field for at least 20 years. I asked him about the mountain. He was careful here, more careful than he had been about the fence or his background. He answered my questions in a way that was truthful but minimal, the way a person answers questions about a subject that they will discuss to the edge of their privacy but not beyond it. He lived on the upper slopes above the second-growth timber. He had built a shelter there over the years, moved it occasionally depending on the season. He was alone up there. I asked him what that meant practically, what a year looked like. He considered the question for a moment, and then he answered it the way he answered everything, directly, with the specific detail of someone who does not see any reason to withhold a fact that has been requested. He spent the deepest part of winter in the lowest shelter he built, the one set into the south-facing slope below the main ridge where the snow was lightest and the temperature stayed above the point where the cold became dangerous even for him. He said even for him with a matter-of-factness that told me his cold tolerance was not a finding he had tested once and concluded, but a fact he understood as a biological feature of his own body, a data point as ordinary as his height. He ate stored food through December and January, dried meat, smoked fish from the creeks above the snow line that ran year-round where the springs fed them, dried berries, roots he had preserved. He described this inventory with the precision of a man running through a checklist. By late February, when the deer began moving on the lower slopes, he was moving again. Spring was the best season, he said. The valley below turned green in March and April, and the edge of the timber above it was loud with birds and running water, and the food came back faster than the people did, the salmon into the lower creeks by April, the berries by June, the elk calves in the high meadows by late May. He knew every food source in a radius that I estimated, as he described it, at roughly 40 square kilometers. He knew which creek held steelhead and when. He knew which south-facing slope grew the first huckleberries. He knew where the yellow glacier lilies came up in April in a meadow that no trail reached, and he had been going there for them since his mother took him the first time when he was 4 or 5 years old. He mentioned this last detail without particular emphasis, but it stopped me. He had been 4 or 5 years old in 1944 or 45. Vera Kettner had been taking her son into the high country since the middle of the war, into terrain that most experienced hikers would not attempt without a party of 3 and a full pack, and she had done it with a small child. I asked him about this. He said she was strong, that she had always been strong, and that the mountain did not trouble her the way it troubled people who had not grown up near one. He said she had grown up in the flatlands of Saskatchewan, where the nearest hill was an hour's drive, and yet from the first year she was in the Bitterroot country, she had moved in the mountains as if she had been born to them. He said his father had told him in his own way that this had been the first thing about her that was unusual, that she was not afraid of where he lived. I wrote all of this down, and then I stopped writing, and I looked at him across the table, and I said something that was not in any RCMP training manual. I said, "Who was your father, Lorne?" The room was quiet for a moment. Bud was very still near the door. Lorne looked at me with those dark, heavy-browed eyes, and he said, "My mother did not have a name for him. She called him the one from the mountain. She met him in 1937, 2 years after she came here from Saskatchewan. She was alone on the homestead, and he came to the edge of the clearing, and she was not afraid of him. And that surprised him," she said. "That was how it started." He set it down the way you set down a bag you have been carrying for a very long time. Not with relief exactly, with the quiet of someone who has made a decision. I said, "What did he look like?" Lorne said, "Like me." "Larger?" The silence after that was the specific silence a room holds when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone in the room understands this. Bud set his coffee mug down on the filing cabinet with a small click that sounded very loud. I asked Lorne if he had ever met his father. He had met him several times on the mountain when he was a boy. His mother had arranged these meetings with some care, going to a specific place on the upper slope and leaving food and waiting. His father had come 3 times that he could remember clearly, each occasion brief, consisting mostly of the two of them sitting near each other and being present in the same space. His father had never spoken to him in English. His father had never spoken to him in any language Lorne could describe exactly, but there had been communication. He paused, looking for the right word. There had been a kind of knowing that passed between them that he thought was not exactly language and was not exactly silence, but was something that he did not have a human word for. I asked him if his father was still alive. He did not know. The last time he had been to the meeting place was in the late 1960s, and there had been no sign. The mountain was very large, and absence of sign was not the same as absence. I looked at my notebook. I had been writing steadily for the better part of an hour. I had documentation of the most significant encounter of my career, of my life, and the clinical habit of my training was the only thing keeping me from sitting back in my chair and spending a long time simply looking at the man across the table from me. I asked him if he wanted anything. Water, food. He said water would be fine. Bud went to get it. While Bud was out, Lorne looked at the map of Agassiz and district on the wall. He looked at it for a long time, and then he raised one finger and touched a point near the northeast corner of the map where the valley floor ended and the contour lines began to crowd together. He said, "That is where the fence is." He moved his finger up the map toward the mountains. "That is where I come from." His finger rested on a section of the map that was blank white space with a few contour lines and no other markings, which was how cartographers in 1969 represented terrain that had been surveyed from a distance and not walked. Bud came back with a glass of water and set it in front of Lorne. Lorne drank it in a way that was careful rather than hurried, 2 hands around the glass, careful sips. Bud watched him and I watched him, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Bud said very quietly to me, "Gordon, you need to call the detachment in Hope." Hope was our divisional contact for anything that exceeded the scope of what the Agassiz detachment could handle. I looked at Bud. He looked at me with the steady expression of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the person who outranked him for this particular call to catch up. I said to Lorne that I was going to make a phone call and that I would be right back. He said, "Fine." I went to the front office and I called the Hope detachment. The duty sergeant in Hope was a man named Earl Dugal, whom I had spoken to perhaps half a dozen times on routine matters. I told him I had a situation at Agassiz that I was not sure how to categorize. He asked me to be specific. I was specific. I told him I had a male individual in my interview room who was 7 feet 1 inch tall, weighed in excess of 350 pounds, was covered in dense body hair, and had informed me that his father was, by his own account, a member of a species that the public and the media of British Columbia had been discussing for years under the name Sasquatch. I told him the individual spoke English, had given me his name and some biographical detail, had been cooperative throughout, and that the charge, as far as I could construct one, was trespassing on private agricultural land with minor property damage. Earl Dougal was quiet for so long that I checked the line to make sure we were still connected. "Gordon, do not write anything else down. Do not use the radio. I am calling Chilliwack, and someone will be at Agassiz within the hour. Keep him there." He hung up. I stood in the front office for a moment with the receiver in my hand. Then I hung it up and went back to the interview room. Lorne was looking at the map again. He had turned slightly in his chair to face it and was studying it with an attention that made me think he was not looking at what was marked on it, but at what was not. The blank spaces, the unnamed drainages, the mountains with only altitude numbers and no other identifying information. I said, "Someone is coming from Chilliwack." He turned to look at me. He said, "Am I being held here?" The question was precise and legally aware in a way that caught me. He was asking whether he had been formally arrested and detained, which carried specific rights and obligations under Canadian law, or whether his presence was voluntary, which meant he could leave. The question was the question of a person who understood the structure of his situation better than his lack of formal education should have permitted. I said, "You're being detained for questioning." He nodded slowly. He said, "All right." He looked back at the map. I sat down across from him again, and I opened my notebook, and then I put it down because Earl Dougal had told me not to write anything else down, and I did not know yet whether to follow that instruction. I closed the notebook. We sat in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. Lorne had a quality of stillness that I had never encountered in a person, a capacity for occupying a space without generating the low-level agitation that most humans produce when waiting. He sat with his hands on his thighs, looking at the map, and he breathed slowly, and the room stayed warm, and nothing else happened. After a few minutes, I said, "How did your mother end up here from Saskatchewan?" He said his mother's name was Vera Kettner. She had come to British Columbia in 1935 by herself at the age of 21 on a one-way train ticket purchased with money she had saved from 3 years of work at a telephone exchange in Moose Jaw. She had read about the homestead grants available in the Fraser Valley, had sent away for information, and had arrived in Agassiz in October of that year with a trunk of belongings, $140, and a land claim on 40 acres of bush northeast of town at the base of the mountain. She had been a practical woman. He said it with a flatness that I took to be affection, as people describe those they loved as practical rather than loving, because practical is a word that does not embarrass you to say. She had cleared 2 acres of the land herself the first spring, built a one-room cabin with timber from the property, and planted a kitchen garden. She had earned money over the first few years by taking in washing for the farms along the Lougheed, walking the 4 miles to the highway and back, with baskets of laundry when the track to her property was too muddy for a vehicle. She had kept a pair of dairy cows, a dozen chickens, and a kitchen garden until the end of her life. He described how she had told him about meeting his father in the spring of 1937. She had been clearing brush from the east edge of her property, working toward the dark timber at the boundary of the land she owned, and she had stopped at midday to eat her lunch, sitting on a stump. She had heard nothing. She had seen nothing. But she had been aware suddenly and completely that she was not alone, with the certainty that you feel when a room is occupied that should be empty, the specific shift in the quality of attention around you that means something with eyes and intelligence has directed those things at you. She had not run. She had sat on her stump and eaten the rest of her lunch. She had spoken aloud to whatever was in the trees in a calm voice, saying that she knew it was there and that she was not going to do anything about that. She had heard from the trees a sound in response, low, continuous, below the register she was accustomed to associating with voice. She had come back the next day with food. It had taken 6 more weeks before he had come to the edge of the clearing while she was there. She had described him to Lorne as she had described everything she found important, with specificity and without decoration. Taller than the tallest man she had seen, dark brown hair across his body, a face that was not animal and not entirely like hers, but that held in its expressions things she recognized because they were things she felt herself: hunger, curiosity, caution, and eventually, over the weeks and months that followed, something she described to her son as comfort. The specific comfort of being near a person who did not require anything of you that you were not prepared to give. Lorne said his mother had been alone for 2 years by the time she met his father. She had not sought it out. She had not gone to the mountain looking for anything. She had been a woman clearing brush on her own property and had discovered in the dark timber at the edge of what she owned the beginning of the most significant relationship of her life. He told me all of this in the same steady voice he had used to tell me his age and his mother's name and the condition of Orville Dupuy's fence. He told me his parents' story the way you tell a child's story when the child is old enough to understand it and the teller is old enough to have made peace with it, clearly without embellishment and with the underlying respect for those involved that transforms an account from a report into a memory. I listened. I did not write. At 11:23, a dark blue Plymouth Fury pulled into the detachment yard. 2 men got out. They were not wearing RCMP uniforms. One was in a dark suit and a tie, the other in a tweed jacket with a collar open at the neck. They were both around 40, both carrying the particular kind of neutral authority that comes not from a uniform, but from being accustomed to rooms that rearrange themselves when they enter. I had not seen this type before, not in 22 months at Agassiz, but I recognized it with a certainty that I attributed later to the fact that certain kinds of institutional weight are visible regardless of what the person wearing it is dressed in. They came inside. The one in the suit introduced himself as Clifford Nish, from a department in Ottawa that he named with a formality I did not then know well enough to evaluate. The one in the tweed jacket did not introduce himself. He stood near the filing cabinets and looked at the room in the methodical way that Lorne had looked at the room when he first entered, though the quality of the attention was different. Lorne had been learning the space. This man was assessing it. Nish would like to speak with the individual in the back room. Yes, of course. He would appreciate it if Bud and I waited in the front office. We would do that. Bud and I went to the front office. We did not speak for approximately 15 minutes. The radio murmured the occasional dispatch from elsewhere in the division. A truck went by on the Lockheed. Bud drank his cold coffee. At a certain point, Bud said, "Who do you think they are?" I said I did not know. He said, "They're not RCMP." I said I knew that. "Gordon," Bud said, "whatever you wrote in that notebook, put it somewhere safe." I had the notebook in my breast pocket. I moved it to the inside pocket of my jacket, the one with a button, and buttoned it. Bud watched me do this and said nothing else. At 12:41 in the morning, Nish came out of the back room. The individual was being released without charges, Nish told me. The file was being closed and transferred to his department's jurisdiction. He placed the form on the desk in front of me and told me to sign it. The form indicated that file number AG 1969-0904-11, which was the file number I had assigned to the Dupuis trespass complaint, was being transferred to federal jurisdiction under an authority cited by a reference number I did not recognize. There was a line for my signature and a line for Bud's. We signed. Nish countersigned, dated it, and folded it into his jacket pocket. The matter was closed, he said. Our cooperation was appreciated. There was nothing further we needed to do. He said this in a tone that made clear that the final sentence had multiple layers of meaning, and that one of those layers was the instruction not to discuss the evening with anyone inside or outside the RCMP. I said, "Where is he going?" Nish said, "Home." I said, "How?" Nish said that transportation had been arranged. His tone ended the conversation. The man in the tweed jacket had already gone back outside. I looked out the window, and the dark blue Plymouth was still in the yard. Lorne was not visible. I went to the back room. It was empty. The chair he had been sitting in had its legs played outward from the weight it had held. The glass he had drunk from was on the table. I picked it up and looked at it. The condensation from the water inside had beaded on the outside because the glass was cold, and the cold of the glass in the warm room had produced a faint film of moisture on the outside surface. In this film, on one side of the glass, was the partial print of a thumb. The pad of it was as wide as my palm. I carried the glass back to my desk in the front office. I put it in the bottom drawer. It is there still, or was there when I retired in 1993, and I never went back for it, which I have regretted since. Nish and the other man left at approximately 12:50. The Plymouth backed out of the lot and turned east on the Lougheed toward Hope. I stood in the parking area and watched the taillights disappear into the dark, and then I stood there for another minute in the September air, which smelled of the river and the fields and the cold edge that a coastal BC night carries in September, a sharpness that tells you summer is finished. Bud came and stood beside me. We looked at the empty road for a while. "Well," he said. I said, "Yeah." We went inside, and I called Orville Dupuis the next morning as I had promised I would. I told him the individual who had entered his field had been spoken to, and the matter was resolved. He asked if there would be charges. I said the file had been closed. He asked what that meant. I said it meant the matter was handled. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That fence post was solid cedar, 4 inches at the base." He meant the one that had snapped off at ground level. I told him I noted that. He said, "All right then," in the tone of a man who has decided that some things are better left where they are, and he hung up. I went through the official motions of the file closure. The paperwork that Nish had had me sign was the extent of the documentation. The incident report I had started, the one I had been composing when Orville came into the lot, contained only the initial call details and Orville's description of the trespasser. It did not contain the interview notes, which I had taken in my personal notebook rather than on official forms. It did not contain the measurements I had taken, or Lorne's account of his parentage, or the temperature anomaly in the back room, or the thumbprint on the glass. The official record of file AG 1969-09-0411 showed a trespass complaint at the Dupuy farm. Responding officer Constable G. Hesketh, matter resolved and transferred to federal jurisdiction. File closed September 5, 1969. 1 page, 3 sentences. I kept my personal notebook. I still have it. The notebook is a standard RCMP issue, field notebook, green cover, 72 pages, and the pages covering September 4th and 5th of 1969 are dense with my handwriting. My handwriting was better then than it is now. I can still read every word. In the weeks after the incident, I asked around carefully. I spoke to Bud about what Nish and the other man had talked about with Lorne in the back room, but Bud had not been in the room and had heard nothing of substance. I asked Wayne, who had heard the radio call from Hope and the subsequent traffic, and who had correctly concluded that something unusual had occurred, though he knew better than to ask directly. I drove out to the northeast end of the Lougheed one afternoon off duty and turned up the logging track that ran along the east boundary of the Dupuy property toward the mountain, and I drove as far as the track allowed and then sat in my truck looking at the dark timber at the end of the road for a while. I did not go in. I did not know what I would find or whether finding it would help me. I sat in the truck for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. The logging track dead-ended at a wide spot where someone had cleared just enough timber to turn a vehicle around, and beyond that the forest closed off in 3 directions, solid and dark and entirely indifferent to the cruiser and the man sitting in it. I had been to the edge of this country 100 times, on patrol, on backcountry calls, on the fishing days that Wayne and I occasionally took when the season permitted and the duty roster allowed. I had always understood the forest as a boundary, the place where the jurisdiction of everything I operated within became theoretical rather than enforceable. Up there, past the second growth and into the old timber, the laws I carried were marks on paper. The mountain had no interest in them. What had changed in the last 2 weeks was that I understood for the first time that the forest had not always been indifferent to me specifically. That at some point over my 22 months in the Agassiz Valley, a pair of dark eyes had watched me do my rounds from somewhere in that timber and reached a conclusion about me, and that conclusion had been acceptable, not a threat, possibly curious. The same assessment, I suppose, that Lorne had made of Orville Dupuy over the 20 or so years he had been coming to the field. The same assessment his mother had earned from his father over 6 weeks of sitting on a stump. I was being categorized, not by anything that shared my language or my institution or my understanding of what the law meant, by something that had been watching the valley from above the tree line since before the valley had a name and had developed its own system of evaluation and had decided that I, Gordon Hesketh, Constable, 24 years old, was the sort of thing that could be approached under specific conditions. I drove back to town. I did not tell Wayne what I had been doing. I wrote up a routine property check in the log and went home to the apartment on Maple Street that I was renting for $80 a month from a woman named Mrs. Vautrin, who ran the place with the efficiency of someone who had been managing the lives of young men for a very long time and had stopped finding them interesting. I made dinner, which was a can of soup and some crackers, and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the green notebook I had moved from my jacket to my kitchen counter, and I thought about what was in it. The measurements, the timeline, the handprint comparison, Lorne's account of his mother's arrival in 1935, her meeting with his father in 37, his own birth in 1940. All of it in my handwriting on the regulation issue pages of a field notebook that the RCMP had given me in Regina and that now contained the most significant record I would ever produce in my career. I locked it in the tin box I used for personal documents and put the box in the bottom of my wardrobe and went to bed. What I was working through in the weeks after September 4th was not disbelief. I had no room for disbelief. The man had been in my interview room. I had measured his height and attempted to measure his weight. I had heard him speak. I had held the glass with his thumbprint on it in my hands. What I was working through was the question of what the experience meant and what my obligation to it was. The RCMP is a paramilitary organization. Obligation is a central concept. You follow orders, you complete your assignment, you maintain the standards of the force. And in the official record, I had done all 3. The file was closed, I had signed the transfer form, I had spoken to the complainant and resolved the immediate matter. By the standard of the institution, I was done. But there was another standard, the one I carried in my chest pocket in a green notebook, and by that standard I was nowhere near done. By that standard I had spoken to a man who was, by his own account and by every physical observation I had made, the offspring of a human woman and a being that the scientific and governmental establishment of Canada, and indeed the continent, had officially treated for decades as a myth. And within hours of my becoming aware of his existence, two men from a department in Ottawa, whose authority I had not been in a position to verify, had appeared and removed him from my custody and closed my file and told me the matter was handled. The file was closed. The matter was not handled, but I was 24 years old and 22 months into a career I intended to pursue for a long time. And I understood, as young men in institutions understand things, that the file being closed was not only a bureaucratic act, it was an instruction, and I followed it. For the next 55 years, I want to be direct about one point. I do not consider myself a coward for having followed that instruction. I have turned this over in my mind many times, and I have always arrived at the same conclusion. The decision I made was the decision of a person who was operating with limited information within an institution that had rules and consequences, and who lacked at 24 the standing or the leverage to do anything that the closing of that file did not permit. What I could do, what I did, was keep the notebook and remember and wait. I made sergeant in 1979, transferred to the Chilliwack detachment in 81, and spent the remaining 12 years of my career managing a larger and more demanding operation than Agassiz had ever been. Chilliwack is a city, not a town. The cases were different in scale and nature. I had officers under my command. I had administrative responsibilities, budget meetings, liaison with municipal police. The years of my career after Agassiz were good years and full years, and I would not trade them. But September of '69 was always there, running beneath everything else, a river beneath a road you do not know is built over water. I thought about Lorne Kettner at irregular intervals throughout those years. Not obsessively, and not in a way that interfered with my work or my life, but he would surface in my mind at specific moments, usually when I was in the mountains or in the deep timber, when the sound of the forest and the cold of the air reminded me of the back room of the Agassiz detachment and the warmth that had filled it from a source that sat across the table from me with his hands on his thighs. I thought about his mother, Vera Kettner from Moose Jaw, who had come to British Columbia alone in 1935 at the age of 21, and built a life on 40 acres of bush at the base of a mountain, and had met at the edge of her clearing something that changed the course of her existence. I thought about what that meeting must have been like and what it had required of her, the specific courage of a woman who sat on a stump after her lunch and spoke aloud to a presence in the trees and then came back the next day with food. There is a kind of courage that presents itself as practicality, and Vera Kettner had it in abundance. I thought about Lorne telling me his father had come to the mountain meeting place 3 times. 3 visits, spaced across the early years of Lorne's childhood, each one brief, each one consisting essentially of proximity and presence, and the wordless thing that Lorne had struggled to name. Neither quite language, nor quite silence, but something in between that he did not have a precise name for. I had read enough by the time I was thinking about this in my middle years to have a framework for what that something else might have been. The researchers who were documenting Sasquatch encounters through the 1970s and 80s described consistently the sense of communication that witnesses reported, a feeling of being understood, and of understanding that operated through channels that bypassed the spoken or written word. The behavioral researchers who were working with our closest relatives in the same period were discovering that the communication repertoire of those species extended far beyond the vocalizations they had previously cataloged into gestural and postural systems of enormous depth. Lorne's description of his father's visits occupied the intersection of those two bodies of knowledge, and the longer I thought about it, the less mysterious it seemed. What Lorne had experienced with his father was not supernatural, it was biological. Two beings of related but divergent ancestry, finding the channels that their shared biology still permitted. I retired in January of 1993, 26 years to the month after I joined the force. My retirement dinner was at a banquet hall in Chilliwack. chicken and mashed potatoes for 80 people, a lot of good-natured speeches, a plaque from the division. My wife Maureen was there, my daughter Claire, who was home from university in Victoria for the occasion, the officers I had worked with in Chilliwack, men and women I had genuine regard for. It was a good evening. It was the kind of evening that marks the close of one chapter and gives you space to think about what the remaining chapters will contain. I drove back to Agassiz the following spring. I did this with full intention. I drove the Lougheed past the Dupuy farm, which had been sold after Orville's death in '87 and was now growing a different crop. Blueberries, the fields replanted from raspberry to high-bush blueberry by the family that had bought the property. The northeast corner of the field, where the fence had been in '69, was now marked by a newer fence with metal posts set in concrete, and the tree line behind it was the same dark fir and cedar I remembered. The mountains were the same. I parked at the end of the logging track, the same one I had driven to 34 years earlier, and I walked. The track was more overgrown than I remembered, the ruts filled in with grass and the edges narrowed by growth, but it was still walkable. I went perhaps a mile into the timber before I stopped and stood and listened to the forest. The forest did not tell me anything that I could put into words. But I stood there in the quiet for a long time, long enough for the birds that had gone silent at my approach to start up again, long enough for a breeze to move through the upper canopy and bring the smell of bark and resin and old moss down to where I was standing. And I thought about Vera Kettner standing at the edge of this timber 60 years before, listening to the same forest with the same attentiveness and feeling what she felt, which was that she was not alone in the sense that mattered. I walked back to my car and I drove home. The question of what happened to Lorne after September of '69 is one I have returned to many times. I do not have a complete answer. What I have are fragments gathered over the years with the investigative habits that 26 years of policing leaves in a person. In the fall of 1971, 2 years after the incident at Agassiz, I was at a regional training day in Chilliwack, and I happened to sit at lunch beside a constable from the Harrison Hot Springs detachment named Bruce Park. We got talking in the general way of officers from different postings who have nothing specific to talk about and so end up discussing cases. I mentioned, carefully and without revealing anything I had committed to keeping to myself, that I had heard there was some unusual activity in the mountains east of Agassiz around '69. I framed it vaguely as rumor rather than incident. Bruce Park said he had heard something about that secondhand from a corporal who had been at the Hope detachment in '69. He said the word from that corporal was that a file had come through in the early hours of September 5th that was unlike anything in his experience, that 2 men had arrived from out of town and driven off with a subject that had been in RCMP custody, and that the following morning the file had been stamped with a classification that even the commanding officer at Hope did not have clearance to access. I asked Bruce if he knew what had happened to the subject. He said he had no idea and that the corporal who had told him the story had retired to the interior by then and did not discuss it. I let the conversation drift to other things. Over the years, I heard a handful of other fragments. A forester working the upper Chehalis drainage in the late 1970s who reported to his crew supervisor that he had encountered a man on a remote service road who was too tall and too broad to have come from any settlement within 20 miles of that location, and who had simply watched the forester's truck pass and then walked back into the timber without a word. A fishing guide who operated out of Harrison Hot Springs through the '80s, who had a standing policy of not taking clients into a specific stretch of river above the East Fork, which he explained by saying the fishing was poor there, but which the clients he turned away sometimes noted was in fact a stretch with good reading water that other guides used without incident. A retired schoolteacher in Agassiz who had known Orville Dupuy and who mentioned to me once, years after the fact, that Orville in his later years would occasionally leave a crate of raspberries at the end of the northeast track on the last day of harvest, and that the crate was always gone by morning, and that this was something Orville had never explained to anyone but had done consistently for the last decade of his life. These are fragments. They do not constitute a confirmed sighting or a documented record, but they form a pattern, the pattern of a person living on the edge of a wilderness and occasionally touching the edge of a human world that was not built for him, leaving no trace that the human world was designed to retain. I do not know if Lorne Kettner is still alive. He would be 84 years old by the calculation of his human age, if he were alive in the way that a person of primarily human biology would be alive at 84. I do not know what his father's genetics contributed to his longevity, and based on what I have read over the decades about the biological characteristics attributed to the species, I would not assume that his aging followed any pattern I could predict. I do not know if the two men who came from Ottawa in the dark blue Plymouth in the early hours of September 5th were acting on information that already existed, a prior awareness of Lorne and his mother and the homestead northeast of Agassiz, or whether my call to Earl Dougal in Hope was the trigger that activated a response that had been primed and waiting. The speed of their arrival, less than 2 hours from a phone call at 9:47 at night to two men in a car in the parking lot of an Agassiz detachment, suggests that the response was not improvised. Someone somewhere in the government of Canada had the capacity to put two men on the road to Agassiz within 90 minutes of a telephone call from a rural RCMP detachment. That capacity implies prior knowledge. Prior knowledge implies that Lorne Kettner was not, in September of 1969, an unknown quantity to the federal government. I do not know how long that knowledge had been in place. I do not know whether the knowledge began with Vera Kettner's land claim in 1935 or with whatever encounters may have preceded Lorne's birth in 1940, or with the meetings between Lorne and his father on the mountain in the late 1940s that Lorne had described to me. I do not know what files exist in what archives under what classifications that contain information about the Kettner homestead and its occupants across those decades. What I know is what I saw and what I was told on the night of September 4th and the morning of September 5th, 1969, in the back room of the Agassiz RCMP detachment. And what I was told was a family history. A woman alone on a homestead, the beginning of a relationship with a being from the mountain, a child born from that relationship who grew up in the bush and continued to live there after his mother's death. A child who had learned to speak from a woman who spoke carefully and precisely about the things she knew, who had learned to read the landscape from a being who had inhabited that landscape for longer than the farm that abutted it had existed, who had come down from the mountain as he had done since childhood to eat raspberries in a field in the September dusk, and who had broken a fence post and apologized for it, and who had sat in a chair in a detachment office in a town that did not know he existed and answered a young constable's questions with the calm patience of a man who has decided that this particular disclosure is one he can afford. He had chosen to come with me. He had said that clearly when I had presented the choice. He had come because he was curious, I think, and because he had his mother's quality of meeting the unusual with attention rather than fear, and because the world she had taught him about was a world in which other people sometimes needed to be spoken to and spoken honestly with, even when the speaking was uncomfortable for everyone involved. He was the most singular person I have ever met. I use the word person with full awareness of its implications and without any impulse to take it back. I was asked in the course of my career to close a file. I closed it. I was a young constable with 22 months on the job and no leverage and no framework for what I had encountered, and I closed the file because closing it was what I could do. But I kept the notebook, and I remembered Lorne's face in the glow of the headlights as I drove him to the detachment, turned to look through the windshield above my head, watching the road the way someone watches a road they are not sure they will travel again. I remembered the warmth of the back room 3 or 4 degrees above the corridor outside it, coming from a body that was built on a different scale of temperature than the one I had been trained in. I remembered the sound of his voice saying, "I have been coming here for a long time," with the ease of a person stating a fact about the world that should not have been surprising and was not surprising to him. I remembered the thumbprint on the glass. I understood the encounter at the time as well as any person could understand something they had no prior category for. What I mean is that it continued to unfold across the decades that followed as a photograph develops the initial image sharp and fixed at the moment of exposure, but the meaning of it deepening and refining and occasionally reversing itself as more light comes in. In the years immediately after 1969, I understood what I had encountered in terms of what I had seen. A man not fully human who spoke and cooperated and told me his history with a directness that had both surprised me and, in retrospect, seemed exactly right for a person raised in isolation by a mother who valued clear speech above almost everything else. I understood the encounter as an event, complete in itself, unusual, unresolvable, but bounded by the four walls of that interview room and the drive to get there. It took me longer to understand it as a relationship, not between Lorne and me, though that night produced something in me that I am not sure I have a clean word for, an obligation of witness, a debt to accuracy. What I mean is the relationship between Lorne and the mountain he lived on, between his mother and the being she had met at the edge of her clearing, between the Dupuis raspberry field and the dark-haired man who had been walking down from the mountain to eat from it since he was a child. These were not isolated events that produced a sequence. They were a continuous relationship between a person and a place, visible across decades, observable in small traces to anyone who thought to look. The crate of raspberries Orville left at the end of the track in his last years, the forester's encounter on the Chehalis service road, the stretch of river that a fishing guide kept clear of clients without explanation. Lorne had not disappeared in September of '69. He had gone back to the mountain, and he had continued to live the life he had been living, with the minor addition that there was now a file in a federal archive somewhere that bore his name. I want to address the detail of Orville Dupuis and the crate of raspberries because it tells you about the valley and the people who live there. When I drove out to speak with him the morning after the incident, I had not expected to find a man at peace with what he had seen the night before. Orville was 61 years old, a Fraser Valley farmer of the third generation, a man who had spent his entire working life in the practical world of soil and irrigation and market prices and the annual gamble of weather. He was not a person you would expect to have a comfortable relationship with ambiguity, but he asked me only the one question about whether there would be charges, and when I told him the file was closed and the matter handled, he said all right and hung up the phone, and he did not call back. Not then, and not at any point in the following years that I remained at the Agassiz detachment. I had expected questions. I had prepared careful non-answers to them. They never came. When I heard years later about the crate of raspberries left at the end of the northeast track each fall, I understood the all right differently than I had at the time. Orville had looked at something standing at the far end of his field in the September dusk, and he had walked back to his truck and driven to town, and the walk and the drive had given him time to arrive at a position on what he had seen. The position was not disbelief, because the evidence of his own eyes was too immediate for that. The position was acceptance, the particular acceptance of a man who has farmed the edge of wilderness his whole life and who understands at some level, even if he could not have articulated it, that the edge is a permeable thing. That what lives beyond it has its own claims on the land, its own relationship with the seasons and the crops that grow in the valley below. Orville had been farming alongside a presence for years without recognizing it, and the moment at the end of the field in the dusk had resolved that question, and his response had been to leave raspberries at the end of the track every fall for the last decade of his life. That is not a complicated response. It is a very old one. It is the response of a person who has recognized a neighbor and acted accordingly. I thought about this during the middle years of my career when I had more time for reflection than the first years allow. I thought about what it meant to live as Lorne lived, outside every administrative system that modern life runs on, without identification or address or formal record, in a landscape that the people below the tree line looked up at and regarded as wilderness when to him it was home. He moved through that landscape with a knowledge that I can only compare to the knowledge a person has of their own house in the dark. Not sight exactly, but the accumulated familiarity of every root and surface and smell stored in the body rather than the conscious mind. His father had that knowledge too, and his father's people, whoever and wherever they were in those mountains, had it to a degree that made Lorne's fluency look like a beginner's. The Coast Range of British Columbia runs from the United States border to the Yukon, a distance of roughly 1,600 kilometers, across terrain that is among the most difficult on the continent, glacier-carved mountains and deep fjords and old-growth forests of a density that satellite imaging still cannot fully penetrate. The human population that lives in or routinely travels through that terrain is thin and specific. The population that lives entirely within it, outside every human record and record-keeping system, could be any size and we would not know, because the conditions that would allow us to know are precisely the conditions they have avoided for longer than the human settlement of this coast. I had a friend in retirement named Harold Sweeney, a biologist who had worked for the BC Ministry of Environment for 30 years before retiring to Chilliwack a few years before I did. Harold was the kind of person who thought rigorously and spoke carefully, which made him good company and occasionally difficult to argue with because his positions were rarely carelessly held. We used to fish together on the Vedder River through the 90s and early 2000s, and in those long shared silences, we talked seriously about things that would have seemed out of place in other settings. I told Harold about the Agassiz encounter in the summer of 2001. I had been carrying it for 32 years at that point, and I judged Harold, accurately as it turned out, to be a person who would not be alarmed by what I had to say and would respond to it with the same rigor he brought to everything else. I told him about Lorne, about Vera, about the interview room and the thumbprint on the glass and the closing of the file. Harold listened with his line in the water and his attention entirely on what I was saying. When I finished, he reeled in slowly and looked across the Vedder for a while. Then he said that what I was describing was not biologically impossible. He said this without drama, as a biologist states that something is not biologically impossible, which is to say with an awareness of what those words do and do not mean. He said that the genetic distance between Homo sapiens and the hypothetical species that the Sasquatch reports pointed toward was, based on the best current estimates and the fossil record's known gaps, probably within the range that would permit viable hybrid offspring, as Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans had produced viable hybrid offspring during the period of their overlap, evidence of which was by that point well established in the genetic record of every non-African human population. I asked Harold what he thought was actually out there in the mountains. He said he thought the most likely explanation for the consistency of Sasquatch reports across the Coast Range, the Fraser Canyon, the Cascades, and extending into the interior was that there was a remnant population of a hominid species closely related to our own that had survived in the most remote parts of those ranges by developing a combination of extreme caution and an intimate knowledge of the terrain that made them effectively invisible to casual observation. He said the Coast Range in particular offered conditions that made this more plausible than it might appear. The sheer scale of the wilderness, the density of the old growth, the consistent moisture that supported both their concealment and a year-round food supply, and the cultural history of the indigenous peoples of the coast who had been describing exactly such beings for as long as their oral records extended. He said the Estes Ales people, whose traditional territory included Harrison Lake and the Chehalis River drainage northeast of Agassiz, had a word for them, Saskets. The word was old, embedded in their cosmology and their oral history, carrying centuries of actual encounter rather than mythology. The word had been adopted into English as Sasquatch through the 20th century. Harold said it was worth considering what it meant that the people who had lived in that specific landscape the longest were also the people who most consistently affirmed the existence of a being that the European scientific tradition had classified as a legend. I thought about Vera Kettner from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, who had come to that same landscape in 1935 with no context and no prior knowledge, and had sat on a stump at the edge of her clearing and spoken aloud to the trees, and had met the same being that the Sense Ales had been meeting and acknowledging for centuries. I thought about what it said that her response had been to keep coming back. Harold and I fished the Vedder together for another 8 years before his health made the trips difficult. In that time, we talked about the subject many times, building a framework for it together that I found useful, not because it resolved anything, but because it gave me language for things I had been holding without language for 3 decades. The language helped. Not because it explained what I had seen, but because it located it in a context that made sense. Not a miracle, not a hoax, not a delusion, a remnant, a survival, a species that had chosen over however many thousands of years it had been making choices to remain outside the human world and to exercise that choice with a thoroughness that we consistently mistook for non-existence. Maureen died in the spring of 2004. Cancer diagnosed in February, gone by April. We had been married 31 years, and she had been the center of gravity of my life for all of them, the person around whom the days organized themselves. The 3 years after she died were the hardest of my life, harder in their particular way than anything I had encountered in 26 years of policing, because the hardship was not external and could not be processed through action. It had to be waited out. I waited it out in the house in Chilliwack that we had bought in '83, and I walked a great deal, and I drove occasionally without a destination, and I thought about the things that had mattered to me and why they had mattered. Lorne came to mind often during those years. I have thought about why, and I have come to believe it was because his story, the story he had told me in that interview room, was above all else a story about a person who had made peace with what they were and where they belonged, and about the courage that required. His mother had made peace with what her life had become in the bush northeast of Agassiz. Lorne had made peace with what he was, a person who existed at the boundary between two worlds and who had chosen, or had the choice made for him by his biology and his upbringing and the circumstances of his existence, to live on the mountainside of that boundary rather than the valley side. He had not hidden from this. He had answered my questions. He had come with me to the detachment. He had spoken about his parents' history with a steadiness that spoke not to indifference, but to acceptance. There is a kind of peace in acceptance that I have found I can recognize, having spent a lot of time in its vicinity without always achieving it. Lorne had it. His mother had had it. The two men from Ottawa who had come and gone in their Plymouth had not had it, or had had a different kind, the peace of institutional authority, which is not the same thing and which does not last in the same way. My daughter Claire asked me in the fall of 2006, when she was visiting from Victoria for Thanksgiving, whether I was all right. She meant it in the specific way that children mean it when they are asking about a surviving parent, whether the absence of the other parent has produced a gap that is growing rather than filling. I told her I was all right. I told her I was spending a lot of time thinking about things I had seen and done over the course of my career. She asked if this was something I should talk to someone about. I told her that talking to someone about it was precisely what I intended to do. I just needed to figure out who. I figured it out, as I had figured most things in my career, by going back to the beginning and starting from the evidence I had. In the spring of 2007, I drove to the Agassiz detachment. The building had been replaced in the late '80s with a new structure on the same site, so the front office, where Butt had stood with his coffee mug, was gone, and the interview room where Lorne had sat across from me was gone, and the filing cabinets and the framed photo of the Queen were all gone. What remained was the address and the parking area and the location. I stood in the parking lot for a while, which was now concrete rather than gravel. I drove east on the Louis to the Dupuis property, which was Blueberry now. I drove the logging track as far as the new growth would let me, which was not as far as before. I sat at the end of the track and looked at the timber. The timber looked back as it always had. I went back to Chilliwack and I called Bruce Park, who had retired from the RCMP in the late '90s and was living in Abbotsford. We had stayed loosely in touch over the years. I arranged to meet him for coffee, and we sat in a Tim Hortons in Abbotsford on a Tuesday morning, and I told him the parts of the Agassiz story that I had not told him 36 years earlier in that Chilliwack lunchroom, all of it. He listened in the careful way of a retired officer, his hands wrapped around his coffee and his eyes on mine the whole time. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he said, "There was a woman in Hope in the mid-'70s. I heard this from a constable who was stationed there then. He said a woman had walked into the Hope detachment one morning and asked to speak with the officer in charge. She had been in her 30s, he estimated, clean and well-dressed and entirely calm. She had told the sergeant that she was the sister of a woman named Vera Kettner, who had died in 1957 on a homestead northeast of Agassiz, and that she was trying to find out what had become of her sister's son, a boy named Lorne. She said she had been trying to locate him for years and had been unable to find any record of his birth or any documentation of his existence. The sergeant, according to the constable who told Bruce the story, had said he would look into it. He had made a call, and within the hour 2 men from a government office in Vancouver had arrived at the Hope detachment and spoken with the woman privately. She had left the detachment with these two men, and the constable who had been watching through the office window had never seen or heard of her again. I sat with this for a long time before I said anything. Then I said she was trying to find him. Bruce said, "That's the impression," I said, "and they stopped her." Bruce said, "That's one way to read it. The other way to read it, the way I had also been reading it since Bruce had finished his account, was that Lorne's aunt had been looking for him, had gotten close enough to the right official channels to register on whatever monitoring existed for inquiries about the Kettner file, and had been redirected away from those channels with enough efficiency to ensure she would not try them again. The two men from Vancouver arriving within the hour carried the same implication as the two men from Ottawa arriving within 90 minutes in '69. Someone had been watching the Kettner matter consistently since at least 1969, and possibly since considerably before. The aunt's name was not something Bruce knew, and the constable who had told him the story was long dead by then. I did not have the means to find out more. But the detail of it, this woman walking into the Hope detachment looking for her sister's son with the directness of someone who had been looking for a long time and had decided that the official route was worth trying, stayed with me. She had been a real person with a real relationship to Lorne. She had wanted to know what had become of him. I wanted to know the same thing, and I was no closer to an answer. I drove out to the northeast section of the old Dupuis property one more time in the summer of 2007. Not to the logging track. I parked on the highway and walked along the fence line at the edge of the blueberry field, the new fence with its metal posts toward the corner where the field met the timber. The blueberries were not ripe yet, the berries pale green and hard on the bushes. The timber at the edge of the field was the same as it had always been, Douglas fir mostly, with some cedar mixed in where the ground was wetter, near a small drainage that ran along the boundary between the property and the crown land above it. I reached the corner of the field and I stopped. The drainage ran through a culvert under the fence and continued down toward the flats below. I stood at the fence and looked into the timber. The light under the canopy was dim even in July, the ground dark and covered in sword fern and the occasional rotted log. I could hear the drainage running. I could hear a raven somewhere in the upper canopy. Then I could hear something else, or not quite hear it, feel it, the same shift I had felt on that evening on the Lough Head when I was walking toward the far end of the field with my flashlight, a density in the air between the trees and attention directed at me from no location I could place and carrying no threat, only presence. I did not move. I looked into the timber for a long time. Whatever was there did not show itself, and I did not expect it to. But I stayed where I was for perhaps 20 minutes, looking into those trees as you watch the surface of a deep lake, and you are not sure what you are seeing at the depth. Before I turned to go back to the highway, I said to the trees, "I kept your file open in here." I touched my chest. "Whatever that's worth." The forest said nothing, but it held the words rather than dispersing them, and I thought, walking back along the fence line, with the blueberry bushes on one side and the timber on the other, that perhaps holding words was a reasonable thing to do with them. There is something I have not yet told you about the interview that night, something I held back for no reason except that the sequence of the account felt right, and I had not arrived at it until now. Toward the end of the interview, perhaps 40 minutes in, and before I had called Hope, I had asked Lorne about the future. Not formally, not as you ask a witness about their plans or intentions. I had asked him as you ask a person you have been talking to for a while about something that interests you. I had said, "What do you want?" He had looked at me for a moment. "I want to keep living where I live." He said it flatly, as if this were a modest ambition, which for the life he had described it was not. "I want the mountain to stay the mountain." I asked him what he meant. The logging roads being pushed into the upper drainages northeast of Agassiz were coming closer every year to the places where he and the others lived. This without alarm, without urgency, just stating a fact about the world that was changing around him. I said, "The others." He looked at me without any expression of having revealed more than he intended. He said, "There are others. Not many, but others." I asked him where. He said on the mountain and higher and in the ranges that continued north from Mount Cheam into the heart of the Coast Range. They were spread thin, moved frequently, and avoided the areas of timber cut in the previous decades. He said they had been moving generally northeast for 30 years, deeper into the ranges, away from the valley and the highway and the steady encroachment of the farms and the logging roads. His mother had told him that when she came to the homestead in 35, the timber that was now second growth east of town had been old growth then, and that the beings who had lived in it had moved when the old growth came down. He stated it matter-of-factly, as a person describes a migration they have watched rather than one they have experienced personally, though I understood that he had experienced it personally in ways he did not choose to elaborate on. I asked him if they were safe. They are careful. He said it like someone says something they have thought about and arrived at as the best available answer rather than a reassuring one. I had not followed up on this detail in the decades after, partly because it led into territory I was not in a position to investigate, and partly because its implications were large enough that sitting with them was more manageable than acting on them. But I thought about it often. The logging roads pushing into the upper Chehalis and Chilliwack drainages through the 1970s and 80s had reached precisely the elevations that Lorne had described as the lower edge of where the others lived. The old growth removal in the Fraser Valley and its eastern mountain approaches was one of the most extensive in BC's logging history. The beings who had lived in those forests had moved. They were still moving further northeast into ranges that the logging industry had not yet reached, but that it would reach in time because the economics of the industry required it, and the geography of the coast, for all its apparent immensity, was not infinite. I had a conversation in the spring of 2009 with a woman named Dr. Janet Lowry, who was a primatologist at the University of British Columbia, that I had arranged through a mutual acquaintance. I did not tell her about the Agassiz encounter directly. I presented it as a hypothetical, a research question, the kind of thing a retired officer who had read widely and thought carefully might raise with an academic. I said, given what we now know from ancient DNA research about Neanderthal and Denisovan introgression into the modern human genome, and given the documented behavioral range and intelligence of known great apes, how plausible was it that a remnant hominid species could persist in a large wilderness area for several thousand years without being formally identified by science? Janet Lowry was a careful woman, and she gave me a careful answer. She said the plausibility depended on several factors, including the size of the area in question, the density of the cover, the species' behavioral repertoire in terms of avoiding detection, and the degree to which the dominant culture of the region was motivated to actively look. She said that in the case of the BC Interior and Coast Range, all of these factors were favorable to persistence. The area was enormous and had large sections of essentially unmonitored wilderness. The old growth forest density was among the highest on Earth. The behavioral sophistication required to avoid detection would not be unusual in a hominid species, with the cognitive complexity that the fossil record suggested for Homo relatives, and the dominant colonial culture of British Columbia had been systematically dismissive of indigenous testimony about such beings for over a century, which had substantially reduced the institutional motivation to look seriously. She said the genetic evidence from ancient DNA was the part of the question she found most interesting, because it demonstrated that hybridization between Homo sapiens and closely related species had happened multiple times in human prehistory and had left traces in the modern genome. She said that if a remnant population of a related species had persisted to the present in a wilderness region with periodic contact with human populations, the genetic signature of that contact would theoretically be visible in the descendants of those human populations who had had the contact. She said this as a theoretical observation without any indication that she was aware of anything that made it other than theoretical. I thanked her and said it had been a useful conversation. She said it had been interesting and invited me to come back if I had further questions. I never went back, partly because I was satisfied with what I had learned, and partly because the closer I came to the professional scientific community, the more clearly I felt the boundary between what I knew and what that community was prepared to hear. The boundary was not absolute. I do not want to suggest that the scientific community is a monolith, or that individual scientists within it are incapable of serious engagement with evidence that challenges the dominant framework. Harold Sweeney had engaged with it seriously. Janet Lowry had engaged with it hypothetically, which was as close as her professional position permitted. There were others, researchers who had spent careers documenting footprint evidence and audio recordings and witness testimony from credible sources, who had built bodies of work that deserved more serious treatment than they received. The problem was not individual capacity. The problem was institutional. The classification of Sasquatch as a legend rather than a biological question was so deeply embedded in the scientific culture of North America that overturning it required not just evidence, but a shift in the framework through which evidence was evaluated, and frameworks of that scale do not shift quickly or willingly. I thought about what it would have taken in September of 1969 for the Agassiz encounter to become the kind of event that could shift the framework. What evidence I actually had: a 7-foot 1-inch male with unusual physical characteristics who spoke English, gave his name, consented to measurements, and provided a detailed account of his parentage. The measurements were in my notebook, the name was in my notebook, his mother's history was in my notebook. And within hours, all of it had been transferred to a federal classification that I could not access. The evidence existed. It had been systematically removed from the channels through which it might have mattered. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it as an observation about how institutions protect the frameworks they are built on. The federal government of Canada in 1969 had as much motivation to avoid the implications of a verified hybrid hominid individual as the scientific establishment did, and rather more capability to act on that motivation quickly and with finality. They had acted. The file was closed, the subject was released and went home to his mountain. And the world continued as it had been with Sasquatch, as a cultural curiosity rather than a biological fact, and 2 men in a dark blue Plymouth driving east on the Lougheed Highway in the small hours of a September morning toward whatever mechanism existed for processing events that the official record was not equipped to contain. There is a question I have spent considerable time with, and I want to address it directly, because it is the question that anyone listening to this account will eventually ask. The question is why? Why would the federal government of Canada in the fall of 1969 care enough about a trespass complaint at a raspberry farm in the Fraser Valley to dispatch 2 men from Ottawa within 90 minutes of a phone call to a rural RCMP detachment? What was the mechanism that connected my call to Earl Dougal in Hope to those 2 men getting into that Plymouth within the hour? I do not have a complete answer. What I have is inference, built from the fragments I gathered over 50 years. The most coherent inference I can make runs as follows. Vera Kettner filed a land claim in 1935 for 40 acres of bush northeast of Agassiz. Land claims go through provincial records. Her name and the location of the homestead would have been in those records from the beginning. At some point after her death in 1957, someone with a reason to be interested in the Kettner homestead would have noted that the land had been abandoned without a formal transfer and with no record of a surviving heir. This would have been by itself merely a bureaucratic anomaly. But if that same someone had access to reports of unusual encounters in the mountains northeast of Agassiz across those years, and if those reports had been collected and cross-referenced, the homestead's location near those reports would have been a point of interest. BC has had Sasquatch reports in the official record since at least the 1920s, when John Green, a newspaper publisher in Agassiz, began systematically documenting them in the 1950s based on earlier accounts. John Green was a real person, the author of several books on the subject, based right there in Agassiz. His work was known to government departments long before it was taken seriously by any of them. The reports he documented were numerous, geographically concentrated in the Harrison Lake area and the mountains northeast of the valley, and consistent in their descriptions in ways that Green himself found significant and documented carefully. If someone in a government department in Ottawa or Victoria had been tracking the Sasquatch question as a security matter rather than a scientific one, which is to say had been asking not what is this thing, but what do we do if it turns out to be real, then the Kettner homestead would have been known to them. Vera Kettner, a woman living alone at the base of the mountains where the reports clustered, who had died without any record of her son, despite presumably having given birth to him, whose land sat unclaimed at the edge of the old growth, was not an invisible data point. She was a thread, And if someone had been pulling threads in that region for years, they would have known the Kettner thread was there, waiting. My call to hope did not begin the investigation into Lorne Kettner. My call to hope told someone who was already watching that the thread had become visible. The 90-minute response time was not improvised. The Plymouth was already fueled and the men in it were already briefed and the file transfer form was already typed when they arrived at the Agassiz detachment. All that had been missing was the occasion. I was the occasion. I drove the cruiser into that field and I found Lorne in the raspberry canes and I brought him in and I called hope. And in doing so, I activated a response that had been sitting in readiness for years, possibly decades, waiting for precisely this kind of contact, a contact point, a legible official record that required a response. This is what I mean when I say that my signing of the transfer form was an instruction. I was not signing a bureaucratic form that transferred a trespass file from one jurisdiction to another. I was being incorporated into a system that had been managing the Kettner situation long before I knew the Kettner situation existed. My signature was the system's way of containing me, not silencing me, because silencing a 24-year-old constable with a personal notebook in his breast pocket would have required more effort than the situation warranted. Containing me, making me an officer who had followed procedure and transferred a file and signed the relevant form, which is to say an officer who had nothing actionable to report to anyone else and nothing to be investigated for. The system was efficient and it was quiet, and it had been doing this for a long time. I was not the first person to notice. The forester on the Chehalis Service Road who encountered a large figure and reported it to his crew, supervisor, was not the first. The fishing guide who kept his clients off the Upper East Fork was not the first. The Sitsalos people who had been describing Saskets to every European who would listen since the first Europeans arrived in the Harrison Valley were not the first. The system had been processing all of these encounters for years, redirecting the more official ones, allowing the anecdotal ones to dissolve into the ambient noise of wilderness region folklore, and maintaining the public position that there was nothing to any of it. I found this when I arrived at this inference in the years after my retirement, not enraging but clarifying. There is a particular relief in understanding a system, even a system that has worked against you, because understanding replaces suspicion with something more manageable. I had spent decades with the unease of a man who had been told that a thing he knew to be real did not exist, and who could not prove otherwise without producing evidence he no longer possessed. What I could do, what I did in the years after 2007, was map the system that had produced that unease and name it accurately and accept that the naming was the most resolution I was likely to achieve. I am 79 years old. I have made my peace with what I can and cannot know, but I have not made my peace with silence, which is a different thing. It told me that the beings Lorne had described as the others were known, not acknowledged, known. There was a difference, and the difference was the reason for the 90-minute response time and the transfer form and the classification I could not read. The federal government of Canada in 1969 was not ignorant of what lived in the mountains northeast of Agassiz. They had made a decision about it at some level above the one I occupied, and the decision had been to keep the knowledge where it was and prevent it from spreading. Whether that decision was made out of protection for the beings themselves or out of the institutional instinct to contain any fact that would require significant rearrangement of existing frameworks, or out of some combination of the two that I cannot untangle at this distance, I do not know. I have thought about it for a long time, and I have decided that the motivation matters less than the effect, which was that a family of hybrid individuals living in the mountains of British Columbia were able to continue living there, unconfirmed and unpursued, for at least the duration of my career, and very probably well beyond it. Whether that outcome was intentional or accidental, it was the outcome that Lorne had wanted when he told me he wanted the mountain to stay the mountain. He got what he wanted, as far as I can tell. The mountain stayed the mountain. The blank spaces on the map stayed blank. I spent a lot of time in the years after Maureen died thinking about things I should have done differently. This is common in grief, and I knew it was common, but knowing it does not entirely disarm it. The Agassiz file was one of the things I returned to, though not in the spirit of self-reproach. I had done what I could do, within the constraints of what I was. What I returned to was the question of whether there was anything still to be done. Not the heroic option, because the heroic option had closed when I signed the transfer form in the small hours of September 5th, 1969. What I mean is whether there was anything smaller and more precise, a record to be made, an account to be left, a notebook's worth of evidence to be placed somewhere that the people who came after me could find it. This account is my answer to that question. I am 79 years old, and my heart is doing what old hearts do. I have a green notebook in a fireproof box in the third drawer of my desk, and in that notebook is everything I recorded on the night of September 4th and the morning of September 5th, 1969. The initial complaint from Orville Dupuis, the drive to the northeast field, the physical description of Lorne Kettner, the measurements, the interview transcript as complete as I could make it, and the account of Nish and the other man, and the file transfer form and the glass with the thumbprint that I never went back for. The notebook is old and the handwriting is mine, and anyone who has the inclination to verify it can do so. What I cannot give you is the glass. I left it in the bottom drawer of my desk at the Agassiz detachment when I transferred to Chilliwack in 1981, and either it remained there until the building was demolished in the late 80s and ended up in a landfill, or someone found it and put it somewhere, or someone found it and threw it away. I do not know which. I regret not taking it. At the time, taking it would have meant that I believed the evidence it contained would someday matter enough to justify its preservation, and in 1981 I was not quite sure of that. I am sure of it now, but now is too late, and that is a small, specific grief that I carry alongside the larger ones. In the winter of 2017, I drove up to the Harrison Hot Springs area on a day when the weather was clear enough to see the mountains. I drove north on the Harrison Lake Road past the Hot Springs Resort and continued along the east side of the lake, where the road narrows and the mountains come down close on both sides. Harrison Lake is one of the largest lakes in the lower mainland area of BC, about 65 kilometers long and deep enough in its northern reaches that the bottom has not been fully charted. The mountains on its east side rise from the waterline to elevations above 2,000 meters, with almost no horizontal distance between, the kind of terrain that is beautiful to look at from a boat, and essentially impossible to move through without specialized knowledge and equipment. The forests on those slopes were some of the last old growth in the region, protected partly by their inaccessibility and partly by the reserve status of the land at the lake's northern end. I parked the car at a pullout where you can see across the lake to the western shore, and I looked at the mountains for a long time. It was December, cold and clear, the snow line down to about 1,000 meters, the upper peaks white and precise against a sky that was the specific blue that the coast gets on its few genuinely clear days. The lake was calm and reflected the mountains as still water reflects the world without interpretation. I had been to Harrison Lake many times over the years, mostly for summer fishing with Maureen in the early 80s when the kids were small enough to sleep in the back of the truck without complaint. We used to anchor off the east shore below the provincial park boundary and watch the mountains turn color in the evening, and I remember sitting in the boat thinking that whatever was in those mountains had been watching the same light show for longer than the province had been a province. Maureen knew I had something on my mind in those years, some ongoing preoccupation that surfaced at the water and submerged again when we drove home. She had the good sense not to ask and the patience to wait. I think she knew I would tell her eventually. I never had the chance. Sitting at the pullout in 2017, I understood something I had not understood on those earlier visits. I had been drawn to Harrison Lake specifically because it was the closest I could get to the upper drainages without leaving the road. The lake's northern end pinches into the mountains, and above the waterline on the east shore, the terrain climbs immediately into country that has no trails, no maintained access, no reason for anyone to be there who is not specifically equipped and motivated to be there. It is one of the larger blank spaces left on the BC map, not because it has not been surveyed, but because there is nothing there to administer. No timber value left at that elevation, no mineral claims active, no recreational infrastructure, just old rock and old trees and whatever lives among them. I thought about Lorne at 31, 35, 40, moving through those mountains with a knowledge of them that no map I could consult would contain. moving with the seasons as his mother had described his father's people, moving, following the food and the shelter and the internal calendar that organisms develop when they live their entire lives within a single landscape. He would have been 57 in 2017 if he were alive, if his biology followed the human timeline for aging. He might have looked 57, he might have looked 40, he might have looked older or younger in ways that had no reference point in any aging curve I had seen. He might have been standing in the timber on the opposite shore of that lake, looking out at the water and the car parked at the pullout and the old man sitting in it. He might have been much further north in the ranges that extend past the Stein Valley and the Chilcotin and the enormous wilderness that fills the gap between the coast and the interior plateau. He might have been with the others that he had mentioned, the thin spread of beings who moved carefully and lived in the parts of the mountains that the logging roads had not yet reached. I do not know. I drove home when the cold came through the windows. I have made that drive many times since in different seasons, and the mountains are always there, and I always look. There is one exchange from that evening that I have held back until now, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most true. It happened toward the very end after I had told Lorne that someone was coming from Chilliwack and we were sitting in the quiet of the interview room waiting. Lorne had been looking at the map and I had been looking at my notebook, and the room was warm with his particular warmth. He had been holding a small silence for several minutes, and then he said, without looking away from the map, "My mother loved it here." I looked up. He was still looking at the map. He said, "She could have gone back. She had family in Saskatchewan. She never went back." He paused. "She said the mountain was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that everything she needed was in the distance between the cabin and the tree line." He said this without sentimentality, without the particular softening that people use when speaking about the dead. He said it as a report of an opinion his mother had held and had expressed to him, which was how he reported most things. I said, "Did she have any regrets?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She regretted that no one she had known before would understand." He paused again. "She said the things that happen to you when you are young and alone in a new place are the things that define you, and that most of those things cannot be explained to anyone who was not there. She said she had stopped trying to explain them a long time ago and was happier for it." I did not say anything to this. There was nothing in my training or experience that prepared me to respond to a son's description of his mother's peace with a life that was, by any conventional measure, incomprehensible. I just listened, and the room was warm, and outside on the Lougheed a truck went by in the dark. He said, "She told me once that the best decision she ever made was not running." I knew what he meant. The stump, the lunch she was eating, the awareness of being watched that she had decided to sit with rather than flee from. The decision of a 23-year-old woman alone at the edge of a clearing who had looked at the unknown and chosen curiosity over fear. He said, "I am like her in that way." He said it simply with no awareness of how much it carried, but I understood the full measure of it. He was telling me something about himself that was also a statement about why he was sitting in an RCMP interview room in a small town in the Fraser Valley, cooperating with a young constable's questions, answering what could be answered and leaving open what could not. He was not there because he had been caught. He was there because he had chosen to come, the same way his mother had chosen to sit on the stump rather than run. He was curious about what would happen. He was not afraid of the encounter. He was meeting it the way she had met hers, with attention. That is the thing I want to leave you with. Not the file number, not the thumbprint, not the dark blue Plymouth in the parking lot at midnight. All of that is real and documented, and it matters, and I hope that someone who comes after me will find the notebook and do something useful with it. But what I want you to carry is this. There was a woman from Saskatchewan who came to British Columbia alone and built a life in the bush at the base of a mountain, and at the edge of that life she met a being from the old world of those mountains, and she was not afraid, and she had a son. And that son had her quality of meeting the world with attention instead of fear. And he spent his life on a mountain in the Coast Range of British Columbia. And he came down from that mountain sometimes when the berries were ripe, and he walked the edge of the valley as his mother had walked the edge of the clearing, with a patience for the slow work of understanding that makes most things eventually possible. He told me the mountain was the most beautiful thing his mother had ever seen. I have driven past those mountains hundreds of times in 55 years, and I have never once seen them, as I imagine she saw them, on a cold morning in the fall of 1935 when she stepped off a train in Agassiz with a trunk and $140 and looked east at the wall of the Coast Range and decided that this was the place. I have seen them as geography. She saw them as a life. That is the difference between the two kinds of looking, and it is not a small difference. I want to say something about the beings themselves, the ones that Lorne described as the others. Not Lorne's father specifically, whom I never met and who is a figure in a story told to me by his son, but the population that Lorne gestured toward when he mentioned the logging roads coming closer and the slow movement northeast into the deeper ranges. I want to say it carefully because it is the part of this account that carries the largest weight and the least evidence. What Lorne described was a population under pressure. Not acute pressure, not the kind of crisis that produces visible distress or dramatic action, chronic pressure. The kind of pressure that comes from a world gradually becoming less compatible with your existence, from the slow erosion of the spaces that your life requires, from the incremental advancement of the systems and structures of another civilization into the terrain that is your home. This kind of pressure does not produce a single emergency. It produces a long, quiet retreat, and the beings that Lorne described as the others had been retreating northeast and higher and deeper for at least the 3 decades he had been alive, and probably for the generations before him. There are people who study the ecology of large mammals under habitat pressure, and the patterns they describe are consistent with what Lorne told me. When a large, intelligent animal loses access to the habitat it requires, it does not disappear suddenly. It compresses. Its range contracts. The population thins at the edges first in the areas closest to the disturbance, and the remaining individuals crowd into the diminishing core of viable territory. If the compression continues far enough, the population crosses a threshold below which recovery becomes biologically impossible, and the species ends not with a dramatic event, but with the quiet failure of reproduction to outpace mortality in a territory too small to support the necessary genetic diversity. I do not know whether the population that Lorne described has crossed that threshold, or is approaching it, or is still far enough from it that the question is premature. I do not have any data on their numbers or their distribution or their reproductive rate. What I have is a single interview with a single individual who described a community moving slowly away from human encroachment, and the logic of what he described is not reassuring. The thing that gives me some hope, and I want to be precise about the kind of hope this is that the terrain they have been moving into is the terrain that is hardest for humans to access and most expensive to alter. The northern interior ranges of BC, the Tweedsmuir Plateau, the headwaters of the Dean and Bella Coola rivers, the Chilcotin High Country, these are places where the old growth still stands in its original density and where the logging roads are still measured in hours of difficult travel from the nearest population center. They are not permanent refugees in a geological sense, but they are refugees in a human planning sense, which means they are places that the systems responsible for the kind of habitat alteration that Lorne described will not reach quickly. I hope they are there. I believe they are there. Not because belief is comfortable, though it is, but because the logic of the encounter points there. Lorne was alive and healthy in 1969 and had been living on a mountain in the Coast Range for his entire adult life, supported by a knowledge of that terrain that no map recorded. His father had been alive when Lorne was a child and had been present in the same mountains. The others had been present and had been moving. A population that has survived in those mountains across the entirety of the European colonial period in British Columbia, from the first fur trade posts through the gold rush and the logging industry and the roads and the farms and the hydro projects, is a population that has survived a considerable gauntlet. It has done so by being careful, by moving, by exercising the intelligence that Lorne's dark eyes reflected back at me in the interview room of a small detachment on a September night in 1969. Intelligence is the thing that outlasts everything else because it can adapt, and adaptation is the fundamental mechanism of survival. I am not a scientist, and I am not asking you to treat this as science. I am a retired RCMP staff sergeant who spent 26 years enforcing the laws of the province of British Columbia and the government of Canada. What I know about the scientific dimensions of what I encountered in 1969 is what I have learned in the decades since from Harold Sweeney and Janet Lowry, and a great deal of reading that I have done because the encounter gave me a reason to read carefully about things I would not otherwise have thought to read about. I am not offering you an academic argument. I am offering you a first-hand account. What you do with it is your business, and I have no expectation of what that should be. The notebook is in the desk in a fireproof box where it has been for 30 years. My name is Gordon Hesketh. I was a constable at the Agassiz RCMP detachment in the fall of 1969, and I drove a trespasser in from the northeast section of the Dupuis Raspberry Farm on the night of September 4th of that year, and I brought him to the interview room, and I asked him questions, and he answered them. And one of the things he told me was that he had been coming to that field since he was a child, and that his mother had loved the mountain, and that he was like her in the sense that mattered. I have thought about him for 55 years. I have thought about what kind of life he made on that mountain, whether the others were close enough to constitute a community, whether the deep drainages of the Upper Chehalis and the Harrison Lake backcountry gave him what he needed through the changing decades, whether the logging roads that were his concern in '69 had come close enough to matter, or whether the terrain had slowed their advance enough to give him room. I have thought about whether he ever came back to the Dupuis field, whether the crate of raspberries Orville left at the end of the track in his last years was answered with something left in return, in the tradition his mother had established when she sat on a stump with her lunch and chose not to run. I have thought about Vera Kettner on the train from Moose Jaw in October of 1935, looking out the window at the Rockies and then at the Selkirks and then at the Coast Range coming up as the line descended through the Fraser Canyon, that first sight of the mountains she had come to, enormous and dark and cut with ice and fog. A 21-year-old woman from the prairies, alone in a train compartment with her trunk and her $140, seeing for the first time the place that would turn out to be the place, not knowing this yet, watching the mountains come up and feeling whatever she felt, which might have been fear or awe or something she did not have a word for, the recognition of a landscape that was somehow already known. The train would have come down through the canyon in the morning light. The Fraser River below the tracks, brown and wide and moving fast toward the sea, the valley opening up east of Hope, the farms beginning, the flat land between the mountains. She would have disembarked at Agassiz in the afternoon in October, the air cold and smelling of the river and the farms. She would have looked east at the base of the mountains. She would have made her arrangements, whatever she had to make, and she would have gone to the land she had claimed, and she would have started clearing. At the edge of that land, at the boundary between what she owned and what the mountain held, she had eventually met something that changed the entire meaning of what she was doing there, not what she was clearing the land for, what she was there for. The distinction matters. She stayed for the rest of her life. Her son stayed for his. And in the fall of 1969, her son sat across a table from a young constable in a small detachment and told him the story of his parents meeting with the same steady calm that his mother had brought to her stump in the clearing when she heard the sound in the trees and chose to stay. Not running is a choice. It is not a passive choice. It is an active decision to remain present with something you do not yet understand, in the hope that if you remain present long enough, understanding will come. Vera Kettner made that choice. Her son had it in his character, and it is the choice I wish I had made more completely in the small hours of September 5th, 1969, when I signed the transfer form and let the men from Ottawa close the file. But I kept the notebook, and I kept the memory. And I have kept the face of a man sitting in a chair that bowed under his weight, looking at a map of the valley where his mother had lived, pointing to the blank space above the contour lines where no road went and no marking existed, and saying, "That is where I come from. The mountains are still there. The blank spaces on the map are smaller than they were, but they are still there. And whatever moves through them, patient and careful and carrying a knowledge of that terrain that no survey has ever recorded, is still there too. I believe that with the same quiet certainty with which I believe that the thumbprint on the glass was real and that the interview took place, and that a 21-year-old woman from Moose Jaw once sat on a stump at the edge of a clearing in the Coast Range of British Columbia and chose not to run. These things happened. They are connected, and the connection matters. Some decisions are made once and last a lifetime. Vera Kettner's lasted longer than that. She made hers on a stump in the autumn of 1937, and it outlived her, and it lives on in her son, wherever he is. If Lorne Kettner is still alive and these words reach him in whatever way such words might travel across the distance between the world I live in and the world he lives in, I want him to know that I have kept my end of what was, in its unspoken way, an agreement. He came with me and I brought him back. The file is closed, but the account is open, and it will remain open for as long as there are people willing to look at evidence that does not fit the categories they were given and ask what that means and not flinch from the answer. It is something. It has always been something. And it deserves to be met as Vera Kettner met it, with attention and with the particular courage that looks like stillness but is not stillness at all. It is presence. It is the decision to stay. My name is Gordon Hesketh. I was there. I am not afraid of having been there. And if the mountains of the Coast Range hold what I believe they hold, then I am glad that the world contains them, and glad that I spent 55 years paying attention, and glad that I had the chance, late and imperfect as it is, to say so.